I'm going to talk about the slap seen around the world on New York City subway. Um, as we know, there was this black woman who started picking a fight with a man with an 8 spot jacket, and eventually it escalated to the point where he slapped her in the face. I'm not going to talk about the dysfunction of black women, the dysfunction of single mother households, or anything like that. I'm going to give you a New York perspective on this because this incident really is a precursor to something that's going to be really tragic for New Yorkers. If you lived in New York during the 1980s, like I did, and the early 1990s, you know how utterly lawless it was, just total anarchy, and incidents like this slap were pretty much commonplace at the time. And what this incident really shows me is we're heading backwards to that period in New York history where it was complete and utter lawlessness here in New York. Criminals were pretty much running rampant and pretty much doing whatever they felt like. I remember going to high school back then. I was going to Park West High School in the late '80s, and going to school was an event. It was dangerous because of incidents like this and crazy people like this. And they were pretty much commonplace. I remember being 14 years old, and I was on a 2 train, and there was a guy, he was snorting up crack rocks in a $10 bill. I was sitting right across from this. And I remember another time when I was on an A train later on, because I had learned how to use the A train instead of the 2 train, where there was a pile of human fecal matter sitting at the doors of the A train I was on. And this is the type of this slap is the precursor to this type of insanity coming back to New York City. I mean, people are laughing at this and seeing it as a bit of a joke, but I see the seriousness of this type of dysfunction and what it leads to. When you look at somebody open hand slapping someone in a train car full of people and the people cheering it on, they don't understand what that represents and what that reflects. Yeah, he checked the black woman, and but that's not the top. That's not the important part here. I mean, what is that this lawlessness and anarchy? This is a precursor to it coming back to New York City, and this is all under our new Democratic mayor Bill De Blasio, and his first. I mean, he's gone past his first year, and this is what's coming back to New York City. This is just sad because under the last 2 mayors, Michael Bloomberg and Rudy Giuliani, we didn't see this type of craziness transpiring on a train on a train. I mean, seriously, I did not see it in the news. I didn't see it regularly. I've lived in New York for 41 years, ever since I was born, and now I see a return of this type of insanity that I saw during growing up during the Ed Koch and David Dinkins years. And that's a lot of people don't understand how crazy New York was back in the late '70s, the '80s, and the early '90s. They don't understand. They're looking at this video thinking that it's a black man checking a black woman. No, it's a foreshadowing to a very, very dangerous future for New Yorkers. And if you lived in New York City during the times that I mentioned, the late '70s, the 1980s, and 1990s, you know how crazy it was. I mean, that's why we had guys like the subway vigilante Bernard Getz taking down those 4 thugs who tried to harass him because it was just that crazy. I mean, people literally you could not ride the trains because they weren't safe, and if you did so, you did it at your own risk because back then it was very dangerous here in New York, and people just they don't understand the gravity of the situation. They're sitting there. Some people are laughing. Some people are just um, they're egging this on, saying, "Yeah, he checked her. He checked." This is not about anybody being checked. This when I saw on that train took me back to the days when I used to ride the subway to go to school, and it took me back to a time in my life where I did at 14. I didn't. I was. It was a terrifying situation. You rode the train, but you didn't know what to expect. You didn't know whether you were going to run into a guy with a box cutter. You didn't know whether you were going to run into a guy with a pistol. There were fights on the train. There was all sorts of craziness in New York back in the 1980s and the early 90s. And I mean, if you really think about it, I mean, I remember they said 1990, 1991. There was 2,000 murders and 2,200 murders in both those years. It was 2,000 and 2,200 murders. I mean, we didn't lose that many people in Iraq and Afghanistan um, as we did in the crack epidemics during that 5 years. During the, I mean, 91, 92, and 87, 88, 89. I remember it was the murder rate in New York was through the roof. And it was literally a war zone because so many people were killing each other. And the sad part was black people killing other black people, and most of the murders, yeah, they were black on black crimes over drug turf, over women, over looks. And this incident, as I see it, is a precursor to a return to that type of violence. And people, you cannot sit there and not take this seriously, because it's foreshadowing something. It's a precursor to what is coming up. Because I look at New York and the crime rate looks like it's starting to escalate again. And this is under our Democratic mayor, Bill de Blasio. It looks like it's starting to escalate again. And we're seeing these type of violent incidents that I grew up having to run into and encounter back in the days of the 1980s and early 90s when I was growing up. We're starting to see a return to these type of incidents where, with the purse snatchings, the beating up, and mugging of old ladies. We're starting to see a return to the shootings and beefs. I mean, you know, these shootings where people kill each other over a girl look, or a look, somebody looking at them, or a pair of shoes. This was commonplace in New York back in the 80s and 90s under these Democratic mayors like Dingus and Ed Koch. And I'm seeing them starting to return again because people aren't taking it seriously. They're taking it as a joke. They're taking incidents like this as a joke instead of saying, look, we can't have this type of behavior in the community. We just really can't have this type of behavior. We need to have some type of standards. I mean, and when you don't have any standards, this is the type of incidents and behaviors you have. And if you keep letting one go, there's going to be more of it happening. And we just sit there and we put up with it. And then later on, we have what we had in the 80s and the 90s, a total, late 80s, early 90s, with this total anarchy. I mean, kids couldn't even go out to play in the park. I mean, I think about growing up back in the day, you couldn't go outside like around from about 88 to about 91 because these drug dealers would be having shootouts in the middle of the street over turf. And we don't understand the gravity of the situation. We don't see where this type of incident leads to other incidents, and how this type of thing unchecked leads to total anarchy. That if you lived through it, you would understand it, and I understand how bad it really was. I mean, you couldn't. Again, New York was not a good place to be back in the day. It was people. The criminals practically ran the city. I mean, the thugs pretty much ran the public places like the high schools and the junior high schools. Drug dealers pretty much ran those places, and they were in with the security guards. They were in with people, and they pretty much did whatever they wanted, and they had complete and total run. We didn't have, and with that type of environment, there could be no economic investment. There could be no economic building. You couldn't do anything in that type of New York because nobody was safe. And sadly, it took, the only thing that made black people wake up really was when the group of Hispanics went to the stab Brian Watkins. When they killed Brian Watkins here in New York back in '91, I think. That's when our black Democratic Mayor David Dinkins finally decided to realize he needed to do something about the anarchy in the streets. Because before then, he didn't care about 2,000 Negroes killing other 2,000 other Negroes. He didn't care. But when one white person got killed, he decided to do something about it. But right now, this incident is like a precursor to black on black crime, escalating and getting back to that crazy period from I'd say 1980s, 88 or even 86. I'll even go further back as just go back to the 1970s because that's New York was a nightmare. And incidents like this are really they're scary to look at when you think about it, because if you lived in the bad old days, this is what you saw every day. And I'm starting to see more and more incidents like this transpiring. These arguments that escalate into fist fights in the middle of the street, people just getting really crazy, and people. I mean, I haven't seen anybody pull any weapons out or anything like that, but I've heard about the shootings and all of this stuff. And this is how it gets started, and it has to be nipped in the bud. And people think it's just a police issue. No, it's us. We have to get this together, because if things decline, the only people who are accountable for that are the people who live in the city. And it's the silence of people that allows these type of individuals to escalate, and it's not entertainment. That's the only point I want to be doing in this video, is that I want people to understand this is not entertainment for people who live in New York, and especially all those of us who lived in New York over the last 20, 25 years and remember those kind of days. If you have to go back to that type of living, I don't want anyone to go back to that type of life, because that was a nightmare. If you had to live through the days of the old New York, where it was just utterly lawless, people just doing whatever they wanted, just going crazy, fighting in the street, urinating wherever they felt like, people drinking in the street. I mean, I remember back in the day, people just drinking beers, just like on a street corner like it's nothing. People shooting up, because the building I lived in back in the day, on Park Avenue next to the Metro North Railroad tracks, a lot of heroin addicts. I lived around a lot of heroin addicts in my building, and you don't really want to live around that type of stuff. You don't want this element to become mainstream and a social norm in your city. You don't want them, because it's going to destroy your quality of life. And long term, once you destroy your quality of life, you're not going to have any way to get business investment in a city. When you have too many individuals that are this dysfunctional, you're not going to get business investment. What happens is, because I remember happening in the 80s and the 90s, what happened was a lot of businesses left New York. A lot of the middle class tax base left New York because it wasn't safe. People getting killed every day. You don't know if you're going to survive coming home from work. You're just going to move. And what happened was, most of the middle class moved out of New York. A lot of the people who have the economic base, like these hipsters and people who so-called gentrified New York, a lot of those people, they're going to get up and leave, because they're going to see incidents like this on a regular basis. They're going to say, it's not safe for me to be here. It's not safe for me to have my kids go to school with these type of individuals. It's not safe for me to go out to the park and go out and enjoy social activities. I'm going to leave, and I'm going to form a community with people who are more like-minded like me and have the same economic aspirations, the same economic goals. What they're going to do is they're going to leave. And that's what happened in New York during the late 80s, early 90s. We had a big exodus of middle-class people. And this is why you cannot see this as a joke or see it as entertainment, because these are the people who bring money into the community. These are the people who build an economic base. These are the people who have made New York into what it is right now. And the big problem is everybody is seeing these people, they're not taking it seriously. And when you don't take situations like this seriously, you don't understand the long-term ramifications of it. I mean, I can understand the long-term ramifications because I've lived through it. I've lived through the drug dealers and the drug posses and all that stuff. And I've been in the neighborhood, and I've seen, I mean, looking out right outside my apartment window one day in 1994, I saw a body of a guy just dumped in the street, and just left for dead. Nobody even cared, and just left this guy, left this black guy dead in the middle of the street, right outside the window of my apartment. And all these situations, you think, oh, this just one incident is nothing, but all of them eventually turn into something because it's creating a culture of dysfunction, and that this culture is turning into a social norm. And you can't have economic growth. You can't build a community where there are lawless people. You can only, what I've seen from the Giuliani years is, you can only build an economy where people are safe. If there's safety, business feels safe to invest, because if there's criminals running around, you're never going to be able to build anything. And I've seen this myself. There's a mall they built called the Concourse Plaza here in the Bronx on 161st Street. And it's right next to a courthouse and an HRA welfare office. And the mall never took off because you had this criminal element there that just made the place uninhabitable. And again, you can't have investment unless people feel safe, unless they feel secure, and unless you have a way of keeping dysfunctional individuals in check. And we don't have that. If we don't have that, we're not going to be able to grow New York City's economy. Long term, when you look at this slap between the ratchet black woman and the guy in the 8-spot jacket, again, it's a precursor to something bad unless this type of behavior is checked. And every weekend I'm seeing more and more shootings, more and more domestic incidents, more and more murders, and more turn back to the bad old days of New York with the 2,000 murders, the 2,200 murders, the 1,800 murders, because it was people. I urge you to go take a look at the history of New York, especially from about 1986 to 1994, during the crack period, during the crack epidemic. Because if you don't check this stuff now, this is what you're going to have to deal with in maybe 2 years, 3 years, or I even dare to say 5 years. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.